Juliette Gréco and Edith Piaf lived in the same part of Paris for years. They moved through the same world, knew many of the same people, and occupied the same general territory of French music and Paris cultural life in the late 1940s and early 1950s. They were never on the same stage together. The closest they came was a hallway in a recording studio in the early 1950s. And even that account exists only in the peripheral memory of people who were present for something else. To understand why this is a story worth telling, why the non-meeting of two women in a corridor is something that deserves to be examined, you have to understand who each of them was in Paris in that period, and what the Paris they both occupied was in those years, and what it meant for two figures of that size to inhabit the same world without their worlds ever directly intersecting. The Paris of the late 1940s and early 1950s was a specific city at a specific moment, a city that had come through an occupation and had emerged into the post-liberation period with a cultural energy that was, in part, the energy of a place trying to re-establish its relationship to itself. The arts in Paris in those years had a quality of urgency that was not simply aesthetic. The existentialist movement, the jazz clubs of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, the emerging Chanson world, the theater and cinema, all of these things were happening in a relatively small geographical area, among a relatively interconnected community of people whose work was responsive to each other's work. Edith Piaf was central to this world in a specific way. She was the dominant figure in French chanson, not as a concept or as a category, but as a specific performer whose name was the most recognizable in the form and whose work defined what the form was in the mid-century for the international audience. She was not in the process of becoming, she was. Juliette Gréco arrived in the Paris artistic world through a different door. She had come through the existentialist milieu of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, through the cafes and the philosophy and the political seriousness of the post-war intellectual left in Paris. And she had become, in the late 1940s, one of the faces most closely associated with that world. Jacques Prévert had written for her. Serge Gainsbourg would later write for her. These were not the same collaborators as Piaf's, and the audiences, while overlapping, were not exactly the same audiences. What is interesting about this is not the encounter itself. What is interesting is the contrast it creates when you hold it alongside what each of them represented in the Paris of that period, and what the world they both occupied believed itself to be doing. They were both, in their different ways, demonstrating the same thing about what a woman could do with a voice in a public space in the mid-20th century. Piaf was demonstrating it through the specific intensity of emotional commitment, through the evidence that a voice could carry more of a human interior than convention-suggested voices were supposed to carry, that the stage was large enough to hold everything a person had been through if the person was willing to bring it. Gréco was demonstrating it through intelligence and literary seriousness, through the evidence that chanson was a form capable of holding ideas as well as feelings, that the texts she chose could be the best texts available, and that she could give them to an audience with the full weight of their meaning intact. These were not the same demonstration. They were demonstrations of different things, proceeding by different means, within the same general world and the same general moment. And yet the effect was cumulative, in the way that effects are cumulative when they proceed from a shared general commitment, even when that commitment is expressed in entirely different individual forms. The audiences who heard Piaf and the audiences who heard Gréco were not entirely different audiences. They overlapped at the edges. The people who wanted both emotional intensity and literary intelligence finding what each offered in a different evening at a different venue. Piaf and Gréco were not alternatives to each other. They were, in the larger sense, collaborators in the same project. The project of demonstrating that the female voice in Paris in the mid-20th century was capable of holding everything. Two women who had each, from different starting points and through different means, established in the same city and in the same general period, the specific seriousness of what it was possible to do with a female voice, who had each done something with the form they worked in that had expanded the form, would have had things to say to each other, if the corridor had been a room, if the passing had been a meeting, if the professional world had conspired to produce an occasion rather than a corridor. It did not. The record is the passing. The account is the corridor. Consider what this parallel occupation of the same space meant in practical terms. Both of them recorded in the same studios. The recording facilities of Paris in the early 1950s were not numerous, and the major performers in the French music world used the same rooms, the same technical staff, sometimes the same arrangers. Both of them performed in venues that were geographically close to each other and served by the same professional networks. Both of them gave interviews to the same press. The question of why their paths never produced a more direct encounter, a formal collaboration, a shared evening, a documented meeting that went beyond a corridor passing, is not a question that the available record answers. The professional world of Paris in the early 1950s did produce direct encounters between major figures in different parts of the entertainment world. It was not unusual for performers who occupied different aesthetic territories to find themselves sharing occasions. That this did not happen with Piaf and Gréco is not, in itself, explainable by any feature of their respective positions or by any obvious professional reason. It is simply what the calendar produced and what the calendar did not produce. What they did not have was a direct connection. No recorded collaboration, no documented encounter that has survived in any form more substantial than the peripheral account of the studio corridor meeting. No letter, no photograph of the two of them together, no interview in which either one described a conversation with the other. The absence is not explicable by antipathy or by any deliberate avoidance. There is no account suggesting that either of them was avoiding the other, or that their circles had some reason to stay separate. The absence is the ordinary absence of two people whose paths, despite running in close parallel for years, never produced a moment that both parties recognized as a moment worth registering. The recording studio corridor encounter, the account that has survived in the peripheral memory of people who were present for something else that morning or afternoon, is described in terms that make it exactly what the word corridor suggests: a passing, a momentary spatial intersection, each person going in the direction they were going, each acknowledged to the other in the way that two people acknowledge each other in a professional space they are both using for their own reasons. No conversation of any length, no exchange that has been described as significant. Gréco continued. She had a long career ahead of her, the recordings that would define her in the decades after the early 1950s, the international recognition that would come gradually and then completely, the work with the writers and composers who found in her voice the specific interpreter they needed. Piaf continued, too, toward the large American concerts, toward the physical difficulties of the late 1950s, and the final recordings that produced, from a body that was failing, a voice that seemed to have found its most concentrated form precisely because everything that was not the voice had been stripped away. Their parallel lines extended through the same subsequent decades without crossing. The absence of a documented meeting is not a gap in the record that might someday be filled. It is the shape of the thing. Two women, two voices, one city, two separate lines running close and never touching, and the city shaped by both of them. The music of Paris in the post-war period carrying both of them forward into the culture that received it. The audiences in France and eventually in the wider world holding both of them in the same general understanding of what the mid-century female voice in Paris could do. What they were to each other in the Paris of the early 1950s was what people who occupy parallel positions in the same cultural world are to each other when their paths run close without touching. Presence is felt, work known, influence moving through the shared medium of the world they both inhabited, without requiring a direct encounter to be real. The Paris they both lived in was shaped by both of them. They did not need to share a stage to share a city, and the city they shared, the post-war Paris of Chanson and Saint-Germain and recording studios, and the particular quality of serious artistic life that those years produced, held both of them fully without requiring them to be in the same room at the same time. The corridor was enough to confirm that their Paris was the same Paris. The passing was enough to make the parallel real. They went in the directions they were going. The hallway held the moment and released it the way that hallways do.